QSO Today, episode 515, Susan Gayle Nordskog LA0CY. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com web page. This week, I want to thank Rudy Hardy, W5HRH, for his $200 donation, Bill McCall, K3PBN, for his $20 donation, and Samuel Tonseth, KI7CDG, for his $10 donation. And the following regular monthly sponsors, whose contributions were recorded this week: John Grusel, KC9OJV, and Mike Rensman. There were anonymous donations this week, and I want to thank them for their support. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a reminder that the response to my amateur radio events calendar has been great. You can get to it from the banner link in the show notes page. This calendar is updated by you, and I hope that it will become the most comprehensive amateur radio events calendar. Please use it and update it with your ham radio events. My guest this week was a recommendation from William Pitchman, W8LV, a longtime listener and supporter of the QSO Today podcast. I found this story interesting because it is a coming home story to ham radio after many years of pursuing an unusual career and finding community and support in retirement. One of the byproducts of our modern society is that elderly people in the West are alone, often separated from their children and grandchildren by thousands of miles. Their deteriorating physical condition begins to limit their ability for social interaction. Amateur radio creates the ability to overcome loneliness and isolation in old age. Susan Gayle Nordskog LA0CY was practically born into ham radio. She learned Morse code from her mother and grew up in Los Angeles surrounded by her parents' ham radio friends. After college, Susan developed a deep love for the sea and a passion for crewing large vessels, even during a time when American ships rarely hired women. Undeterred, she immigrated to Norway, completed a 3-year ship's officers course, and started a family. Her career took her across the world's oceans on some of the largest ships afloat. Now LA0CY is back on the air, actively participating in the local ham radio scene on 2 meters, and always ready for a chat on any topic with fellow ham radio operators. LA0CY is my QSO Today. LA0CY, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Susan?
Roger that. This is LA0 Charlie Yankee.
Susan, it's so nice to have you on the QSO Today podcast. Before we get started, what city is your current QTH?
I'm in Grimstad in Norway, and it's about an hour from the southern tip where the ferry boats go over to Denmark by car.
And it's beautiful during the summer, and it's cold during the winter.
Yeah, it can get it's not really cold, but once in a while you get an awful lot of snow all at once. And we have a lot of steps over.
I'll put some links in the show notes pages to your YouTube channel so people can actually see what those steps look like. But anyway, let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
When I was about 5, I guess. My mother was a ham in 1941, W9 KSA. And my father was a ham, but we don't really know what call he was, but they were both hams before they met each other. They met during the war, and she was an electronic technician. And so we learned Morse code when we learned to write. So that's always been there.
So you had siblings.
I have two sisters, yeah, and both of them got the same thing. They got Morse code when they were little, and when my mother wanted us to come back to the car in the park, she'd beep high on the horn.
I've interviewed, actually, hams who got their licenses during World War II and ended up actually kind of in the business. It seems unusual that your mother had a ham radio license. Do you know anything about that?
No, but she started it in Kansas City, and when the war started, she started working as an electronic technician for the government at I think Wright Airfield, Wright-Patterson, and so she's always been she got into it by herself. I never heard of anybody else she knew. She just is. She's a little strange too.
You had this early interest because your mother was an electronics technician. She was a ham radio operator. How did it proceed from there? You learned the Morse code, as maybe your sisters did as well. What happened after that? How did she nurture this electronic interest along?
Well, I didn't really do much with it until I got in high school, and I took the novice when I was 15. But in the meantime, I was doing things like taking clay and trying to make ripple tanks on the garage floor and that sort of thing. So I always liked technical things, but not. It wasn't exactly radio. Everybody we knew were hams anyway. Everybody. Oh, my mother was one of the ones that started the YLRL. She was one of the first ones in it, and so all the women in the clubs were her friends, and most of their OMs were also hams. So sort of our entire adult circuit were hams.
Was that Dayton, Ohio?
No, we moved to California when I was 5.
Where in California did you go?
Ended up in Los Angeles.
The hometown was Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, yeah, a little bit east. And there were a lot of hams there.
I grew up in the Los Angeles area, Southern California, during the 60s, and you grew up in LA during
the 50s. I think I got my license in 62, and then I was about a sophomore in high school. I think it was 62. It may have been 63, but I was 15 anyway.
And what was your first call sign?
WV6WFZ, and then it turned into a WA6WFZ when I got my general. I don't think I ever got an advanced, but a few years later, I got the extra class, which was 84K.
In those days, you actually had to do the 20 words a minute.
Yeah, and that wasn't a big problem. I decided to take the third class telegraphy test, telegraphy or whatever, just for the heck of it, since that was also 20 words a minute.
So you got your third class telegraphy license.
Yeah, but I was already on the boats I started as ordinary seaman.
So you grew up in Los Angeles. Everyone you knew were ham radio operators. Were there ham radio operators that were the most noticeable in terms of that might have influenced you as a child, that your parents knew?
Well, everybody they knew were hams, so I suppose they all influenced me. But when I got my general, I started, and my driver's license, I joined the AREC, which is now the ARES. Apparently it's changed names, an amateur radio emergency corps it was that time, but it's changed.
Were you involved in a radio club there too as well?
No, that was sort of it, but there were a lot of people in that one. A lot of meetings, a lot of driving around in the car and things like that. We already had a car with antennas on it all over it, the kind that knocked off gasoline station lights. We had to put them in the window every time you went into a gas station, or you were in bad trouble.
And did your sisters also get ham radio licenses?
No, neither of them did. I was the only one. I was the oldest one.
You had an interest in physics. If you were making wave tanks on the floor of the garage?
I've studied geology and with a minor in math. My projects were sort of technical.
It seems obvious. You have the knack.
I like doing things differently, find out what everybody else has done and then do it a different way.
This interest in amateur radio and physical things led to degrees in geology and math?
I have a major in geology and a minor in math.
Where'd you go?
Northern Arizona University.
You had to get out of Los Angeles as a college student?
Well, and more rocks. Yeah, I spent a lot of time down in the Grand Canyon and joined a hiking club and sort of lived there every weekend.
And what happened to amateur radio? Were you kind of actively involved?
I wasn't in college, no. I did get, the extra class, but I didn't have any radio with me. I couldn't really have it in dormitories or anything, so I didn't do really radio there.
Once you graduated from college, what kind of career did you pursue?
I got a job at Gulf General Atomics as a technician for a year and saved up money, bought diving equipment, and went down to Yucatan. My mother dumped me off in Tijuana with all my trunk of diving equipment, and I took the bus down to Isla Mujeres in Yucatan and stayed there a half a year. Did diving and underwater photography there, which I was really interested in that time.
So you're scuba diving in the Caribbean. That sounds amazing. And you were paying for it with pictures?
No, I saved up enough to get down there, and if I helped get tourists on the boat, they caught a big barracuda every day, cooked it, and then you got all you could eat free. So it didn't really cost anything to live down there, really.
Did you become a dive master as well to kind of help people into the water?
No. Most people were scuba diving. I'm not scuba. Most people were actually just free diving and using face masks. Most of the tourists didn't know how to dive. So it was mostly just swimming around on the surface, looking at the reefs, which were really good. I got down to the point where I could free dive to about 60 feet back then. Can't do that anymore.
As I understand, free diving also uses very large fins.
Yeah, you don't want to lose them at the bottom.
Because you need to go up.
You got to get up, yeah, and you know how many seconds you can go down and up. You know how many seconds, and you just count.
What was the longest time that you were able to stay underwater?
I don't remember that, but I do remember it was the guy that owned the boat said that was 60 feet there.
How long were you down in the Yucatan?
I was down there about a half year. Part of the way through that, I met some people on a sailboat that wanted to go back to Texas, and they missed it. They didn't have enough crew members, a little sailboat. So I took the boat back to Texas, and then I jumped on a bus and went back to Yucatan as soon as we got there to Galveston.
You were in Yucatan for quite a while?
Yeah, about a half a year altogether.
And then what happened after that?
I ran out of money. So I had to come home.
Once you returned home to Los Angeles, how did you then prepare for the next stage of your career?
I got a job at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography as a marine technician. I worked there a year, and I found out really fast that the crew had a more interesting job on the bridge. So after a year, I quit there, and I drove across Canada and down the East Coast checking at research ships and seeing if I could get on a crew of a research ship. I ended up at Duke University in North Carolina, and I got a voluntary job, unpaid job to start with for a few weeks, and then they hired me. So I was on there for about 7 years on the Duke ship, the Eastward.
Let's go back to Scripps for a second. The Scripps Institute is just north of La Jolla, right?
Yeah, it's in La Jolla.
It has one of the deepest submarine canyons on the California coast, right below the Scripps Pier. Did you scuba dive into the...
No, I did scuba dive just right along the coast there. You don't want to dive any deep. You can't go very deep with scuba without decompressing. So no, that was sort of on the side, but I really got into underwater photography there, and I was having a lot of fun with that. But the ships went everywhere. I mean, we were sent down to South America or Tahiti or wherever the ship was.
There was a lot of variety on the ships.
Yeah, there was variety for a marine technician. Well, we were just collecting. We had nets that collected fish and plankton, what have you. But I spent most of my free time up with the crew on the bridge. They taught me how to navigate with the stars and that sort of thing, and I found out pretty fast I wanted to be on a crew, not as a marine technician.
What's very interesting is just this transition from geologist, mathematician, and then the scuba diving part, and then finding your way on the bridge of a ship. So how did the story go? It sounds to me like you spent many years at sea.
Oh, I've spent about, all my working life practically has been at sea. And I was home for a few years when I had 3 kids. When they were little, I had to be home for a few years, and then my husband quit his job because I was making more money as a deck officer. So he retired, and I went back to sea. I kept on going until just a few years ago when oil prices fell and all the jobs on the boats, everybody got laid off.
In your career, what kind of ships were you on?
It's easier to say what kind I wasn't on.
Once you joined the crew, I guess it didn't matter then whether you were on research vessels or cruise ships or merchant marine ships.
It was fun on the research ship because I had a fish tank behind my bunk, and if they got an extra baby octopus or something, I could throw it in the fish tank and keep it there, So I had a lot of animals behind the bunk in the fish tank. One time I had a little baby octopus, so I threw him in a tank, and he crawled out, and I threw him in again, and he crawled out, and I stuck him in. And I found out why he wanted out. There was a short circuit to the light. It was kind of, he was getting a shock. So he didn't want to stay there. He would rather be on my pillow. During
this time, you were not active in ham radio, but...
No. Oh, well, I did build on that ship. I did build a Heathkit linear amplifier, but I never really used it. I gave it to my mother.
Did you have radios on the ship, though?
No ham radio, no. I started dragging the radios after I came to Norway, and they sold the ship in 1980, and we're going to build a new one. And the captain was Norwegian. He said, well, why don't you go to Norway? So I did. I took both mate school and the captain's school here in Norway. And in between, I was going on ships to finance it. And I started dragging my Kenward 520 on my back, TS 520, I think it's called.
But you now have a last name, Nordskog. Did you marry a Norwegian?
I did in 1984.
And was he also on ship? Is that how you met him?
He was on the ship, yeah. He was on the same ships. And he wasn't a deck officer, he was a steward, but I made him take the deck officer school after we got married. So he became a deck officer also, and we just alternated watches.
What was the largest ship that you were an officer on, and what kind of officer were you on that ship?
I was mostly first or second mate. The biggest ship I was on was the car carriers, probably. They had 12 decks of cars.
Car carriers? So they carried thousands of cars.
5,000 cars or other vehicles. Yeah, they were pretty big ships at that time. And they were fast. They went about 20 knots. But like I say, I've been on a lot of ships. But I ended up as what they call a dynamic positioning officer, which means you sit on a computer and you move the ship where you want it to be when you have divers down. I did that for a lot of years, or else surveys with remote operated vehicles where other people ran the things and we just put the ship where they wanted it, followed the patterns. But mostly divers. I was about 7 years on a diving ship in the Gulf of Mexico mostly. You could look at the fish, it was fun to look at the fish all the time, whatever they saw, or the divers.
So you ended up in Norway because you wanted to take the officers' courses. The officers' courses offered in English?
Oh, no. The thing was, I needed to get on bigger ships. And American ships really didn't have any women on them practically at that time. They're talking about 1980. So the captain said they've always had women on the ships here. So he thought that was a better place to get better tonnage so I could get a better license, higher licenses, because it was only 500 tons license on the Eastward, on the Duke University ship.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called value for value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. You get a sense the cruise ships are made in Europe, Nordic countries. They're flagged oftentimes other nationalities besides the United States. Does the United States not have its own fleet of merchant ships and car carriers and things like that?
They do, but they didn't have very many women on them at the time. The Norwegians have a tradition of the women being on the ship. They've been radio operators forever. And a lot of people took their wives along. If they wanted their wives on a trip, the company paid for it. They just took their wives on the trip. It's been on big ships too. So usually you had one or two wives along as well as the crew, and kids sometimes even.
Are we just speaking Norway here, or are we speaking European ships in general?
I think it's mostly Norway.
Were you ever on any cruise line ships?
No.
Mostly commercial?
Mostly commercial. Over here, it's been just commercial ships and, dive ships and all kinds of ships. Oboe ships, oil tankers, you name it. Supply boats, ro-ros.
Are they comfortable for the crew? If you're on a car carrier or you're on an oil tanker, does the crew have some comfort spending weeks at sea?
Oh, yeah. You see, the car carriers, they're huge anyway. They look like a shoebox. And the whole top deck is accommodations in the bridge. So that's an enormous area. You have huge cabins. The cabin was probably almost as big as my apartment is here. And I was just a second or first mate.
What kind of recreational facilities do they have on board? Can you play tennis? Can you swim in the pool?
No, they didn't have pools or anything like that. I think they had shooting competitions once in a while with air guns. We didn't have anything. On a research ship, they tried to do things like shuffleboard or something on the deck, but when the ship rolled, that put an extra challenge on it. But no, they didn't have anything really organized. They give points for exercising on trim exercise bicycles and that sort of thing, and you got T-shirts for it.
Because they want to keep the crew fit.
They want to keep their fins.
You could read a lot of books on a ship, it seems to me.
Oh, I did.
What was the most memorable learning experience on one of these ships for you? If you're looking back, is there some stellar moment on board a ship that you'll always remember?
Probably the most shocking one was once when I was up by Maine, and I came up at a bridge in the fog, and the guy said, well, I'm not quite sure where we were. Well, we were pretty close to a harbor, but I looked in the radar, and there's a boat coming right at us. It would actually, I had the right of way, but then I listened out the window, and it was giving a towboat signal, tugboat. And so that means it had the right of way. And the only way you could tell the difference was the signal they were sending on their horn. And so I just turned 90 degrees, and which would make me as far away from them as I could possibly get. And also in quiet waters and places like that, a seagull looks just like a sailboat on the radar. And they're always going to head right at you.
The radar will bounce off a seagull?
Yeah, and the seagulls will always fly right at you.
So you get to be pretty good at looking at the radar and deciding whether or not it's another boat or a seagull.
Yeah, because a sailboat. Yeah, it's because they look the same.
I've interviewed on the podcast one lady who went around the world by herself in a sailboat, and that was her biggest concern was, in the open water running into a large ship that didn't see her. She kind of slept with one eye open.
Well, that's a good idea. Because if there's heavy seas, they might not pick up a sailboat. A sailboat doesn't make much of a target, especially if it's got a wooden mast.
Apparently the shipping lanes are busy.
Some places they are.
You spent 40 years on boats?
Except for I was home for about 10 years with raising kids. I did try to put an antenna on the roof here. This is a terrace apartment, so we've got people on our roof and people under us and everything. They don't really like antennas very much. So I did put back then a 10, 15, 20 vertical on the roof, but it blew off the roof. I sort of gave up, and the 2 meters is straight up the hill, 44 steps straight up the repeater. So there was no way to get into the repeater. I thought there was an 8-way. And the other repeater was 25 miles further south, and you couldn't get into that either. So I almost gave up on radio for a while.
There's a couple of YouTube videos. One of them is how you actually got into the repeater with your Yagi antenna. But before we go there, you spent 10 years getting your family started. Then you went back to sea. Did the kids ever come with you?
No, they stayed home. They were in school age by then, and they didn't. And when I went back after the kids were big enough, my husband retired. He's older than I am by about 11 years, so he retired, and I just kept on going.
You're obviously originally from Los Angeles, like I am. You're an immigrant to a new country, at least in the 80s when you went there to go to skipper school and learn how to be an officer on a ship.
Yeah, well, I'd been an officer in North Carolina, too. I'd even been sub-captain, but I wanted bigger ships, tonnage on my license.
How was it immigrating to Norway?
Well, I'd been to school for 3 years before I get married. And if you want to learn a foreign language, I would suggest just taking a course in whatever you're taking a course in, and just learning the language by doing it, because I knew all that stuff before from being an officer on an American ship. So it was just a review, really. And so I picked up the language, taking the courses.
I've been in Israel 24 years, and I can't say that I'm a Hebrew speaker. I mean, I get around. I never took a course here, and that sounds like that's actually very good advice, especially if you actually know the subject beforehand. Then you can start associating the words with the information that you already know. You became fluent.
That depends on who you ask. I have a terrible accent. Anybody that learns a language as an adult is going to have they're going to have an awful accent, and you'll never get rid of it. All I have to do is say hi and say, where do you come from?
I have the same problem here. I never have a problem with the security here, because as soon as I start speaking, they know who I am, and they wave me through. The immigrant experience then for you, once you started mastering the language and you were working on ships, it kind of all came together for you then.
Most Norwegians speak a lot of English anyway, but it was never any problem. I could always communicate. And of course, on the ship, everybody has to basically speak English anyway, if you wanted to. But when I got married, I said, okay, you speak perfect English. I speak lousy Norwegian. We're going to speak Norwegian together. And that's what we did forever. We still do.
In raising kids, did you speak English to your kids and he spoke Norwegian?
Yeah, well, yeah, he spoke Norwegian to him and I spoke English. But when they got up at the school age, they don't want to, it's just yes or no. They understand you, but they don't want to, they want to speak the Norwegian. But the grandkids weren't like that. They think English is wonderful, and I think it's computers. They can sit there and chat to people while they're playing games, and English is how you do that. So they go in for English deliberately. I mean, they're really enthusiastic.
I find European kids who learn English become very good English speakers. When I run into them, I can't say that they're speaking like native English speakers, but they're doing pretty good. They do a much better job, I think, than around here, where you could go to 12 years worth of English and you're not really an English speaker.
Yeah.
So how did you get back into amateur radio then?
Well, I always considered myself a ham. I mean, I always renewed my extra class whenever it went out and stuff. But then I decided I wanted to be get the sea captain's license, not be a captain, but at least get the top license. And to do that, you had to change citizenship. And to do that, you had to give up the American citizenship. And I think that might be the problem. But suddenly in 2018, I couldn't renew. I tried 3 times. I couldn't renew my license. But I had a Norwegian reciprocal license, 44 years now. But they said I could keep on using that, but I wanted to take the course. So I took the course too. And then I took the test here. And it's about equivalent to the extra class. They only have 1 class license here.
Norway only has 1 class of ham radio license?
No, the guy in the NRL, the Norwegian Radio Relay League, said it's equivalent to an extra class. And I'd say it's more than that, because back when I took the licenses, it was half Morse. And I knew that. So that was easy. And now they've replaced all that with theory. And not only that, they've invented everything since I was inactive. Basically, all the modes and things, the digital part. I think they had RIDI, but that's about all back then. So
did you take a course or did you do book learning in order to be able to pass the Norwegian test?
I took the course. Basically, the test is memorized book, which is about that thick. And I did that. I passed. It's multiple choice. It's 60 questions, and I guarantee it's worse than the extra class was, because I spent 2 weeks studying for the extra class, and this thing, I took that course for 3 months. It was still a challenge, so it's a pretty rough test. I needed to get up to date. I mean, I was really out of date.
No, I thought that foreign nationals, as long as they have...
I couldn't renew it anymore in 2018.
Could you have taken the test again in America?
Oh, possibly, but I don't live there.
I see that there's a number of foreign nationals that somehow get an American amateur radio license.
They may have, I don't know if they have special numbers. In Norway, you have the 0, means it's a reciprocal license, the number. You don't have that in America. You've got all the numbers.
They used to correspond to the states, right? 6 land was California. But I think people can get amateur radio licenses with any call sign and be anywhere. So you could be a W1 and live in California. You got the Norwegian amateur license.
I got the license, the reciprocal license in 1980. And they said, well, you can just keep on using that. I said, no, I want to take the test. So I took the test too. And that's why I've got the reciprocal number on the license. The tests, I took the up-to-date test.
Are you active in amateur radio organizations in Norway?
There's a local club. Boy, since I got on 2 meters, I've got contact with everybody. That antenna that pointed towards the rock and, ping-pongs its way to the repeater, it opened up the world, because we have a very active 2 meter, and they're all on HF too. They have the same license, as well. So there's a club here, and they're very helpful, and you can always ask them right over the air if you have trouble with something. Like I've been told that my audio on this transceiver sounds kind of squishy. So I'm going to he's going to talk to me on the telephone, and I'm either that or I'll go over and set it up. He's got the FT710 also. We'll find the right settings. That's the current rate, the one behind me, it's FT710. And I bought an antenna tuner because I was a little afraid of my experimental antennas and the SWR. So I thought, if I have an antenna tuner, it's not going straight back into the radio if I do something wrong.
I saw a YouTube video that you're using an end-fed wire.
Yeah, that was the second attempt, yeah. Yeah, that little one, neither of them are getting out as well as I'd like to. And I think it might be the audio. So I have talked to a guy that he was in Tønsberg in northern Norway, middle of Norway, and his antenna was down in Spain, remote. And I spoke to him over the radio, and that was fine. But he talked to Australia right afterwards. He had a QSO with Australia with that antenna, so he was presumably running a kilowatt, but that worked. But locally, I haven't heard anybody on HF except one person, and he could just barely hear me. So I think I have to do something with these antennas. I hear a lot of people, but it's not. I think maybe it's the audio. It's not the power. It's 100 watts. It's the antenna or the audio. Probably the audio. Not much you can do wrong with an end-fed tuner with an antenna. I mean, end-fed antenna with an antenna tuner.
What bands do you like to operate on?
When I was in ARAC, is 40, but I think I'd probably go to 15 now. 20 is kind of busy, and there's contests every weekend now, so it gets pretty busy.
Here in Israel, at least in this part of the world, it seems to me that there's some kind of contest going on in Europe every weekend.
There is.
I hear the Italians and the Russians mostly, but I hear that it can be quite busy on the weekends. What's your favorite operating mode? Are you doing voice?
Well, I've tried sideband. I really don't have the ear for it now anymore.
Have you looked at the digital modes?
They were invented long after my time, but I've got computers all over the house, so I could do that. But Again, that goes mostly on signal reports and my name and this is where I live and that's it. And I'm a female. I'm a rag chewer. That's what I want to do. I just want to talk to people.
You have 3 amateur radio videos, but anybody that's been looking at your YouTube catalog realizes that you've been actually YouTubing for quite a while, 6-7 years, I think, right?
15.
So if you look at your YouTube channel, you appear to be an inventor as well of like mechanical devices. You've created devices for enhancing your photography.
I like taking pictures, but I always wanted to try different things like time-lapse and sliders, which move the camera as you take the pictures, maybe with time-lapse and things go past. And then also with the bicycles, I wanted to take pictures of myself bicycling without holding a stick out. So I made a long pole. Actually, I think it was one of these rods with threads on it, and I put a whole lot of nuts and stuff on the back end as a counterweight, mounted that in my head, and then put the camera on the end. And then I could take a picture of everything all at once while I was riding the bicycle with that thing on my helmet. I'm going to do that now. The next video will be 2 meters on a electric tricycle, I think.
I saw the electric tricycle in one of your videos, and so you're going to add a rig to the tricycle. Is that your primary mode of transportation around town?
No, I drive a car because of my husband, but I've driven all over southern Norway and filmed clear around to the other side of Norway. And I've been into mostly 360 cameras now lately. It's all variations on 360s the last 4 years or so. Other than that, I just took routes, all the bicycle routes I could find or invent, and filmed them and put them out there.
How do you do that in 360? I mean, do you have multiple cameras?
No, I have a 360-degree camera sitting on top of my head, on top of the helmet. I made an attachment for it. And then I made an external microphone I could stick inside the helmet so it doesn't pick up just wind. I plug a battery and stick it in my pocket, and then I could run that camera for about 6 hours. So I could take a nice long bicycle ride and film everything in 360.
So they can go along with you
You ought to try virtual reality goggles, but
That may be what I need to do, because for some reason I didn't know there was 360 cameras. I always thought that 360 was done with multiple cameras.
they're done with. There's a little dead spot right at the bottom, and you can fill in, or that's where the pole is. You don't really notice it. There's overlap. The pole disappears basically. So it's 360s. There are lots of them. I've got about 5, I think. I just got a new one now.
You made a camera mount on wheels that's on a tube track. I got the impression that perhaps was like a mount for, they put a camera on railroad tracks, for example, or on tracks to do a scene where they're moving. But you're actually, a slider is something that you would use in a studio so that it would look like you had a moving camera on you while you're talking.
Yeah, right. It's slider. Mine are only a couple of yards long. It's so steady that you can take time lapses and it still looks steady, So you can take clouds and then go past the bushes at the same time, or things like that. It's kind of a challenge. It's fun.
How do you move the slider? Are you moving with your hand?
No, usually they use motors on them. I might have you have a little motor that just creeps along the thing, a track. You can also make a slider where you actually do pull it with a string.
If you've got a YouTuber or a news presenter and he's the only one in the studio, so he's got the camera that's in front of him, but then he's got a camera off to the side and that camera appears to be moving along, that's a slider. And they'll cut to that camera to get a side angle because it's moving sideways. It looks like there's a studio camera that's being moved by a camera operator.
It's just a way to get a different angle. It looks like you're moving, different foregrounds.
You built a Steadicam also.
Oh, I built several of them. I think they weren't really good, but I finally bought one that was gyroscopic. I could put that on my helmet and then put the camera on top of that, a regular camera. It will keep level. This isn't the 360, a regular camera, and it'll stay steady too. That's another way to do that. You could put the gyroscopic gyroscope on. You put it on your head, and then the camera on top of that, and then the camera just takes a picture. But when you turn your head, it stays level.
As a person who was kind of born into amateur radio, and it seems to me that with parents who were ham radio operators and living in Los Angeles at the time when everybody was a ham operator, at least everybody around you was, what excites you now the most about ham radio now that you're back into it?
Well, it's a social group. Hams are always there. When I was getting a new ship was being built in Sweden, and I wanted to take my transceiver, and I needed an antenna. The club in Uddevalla came and helped me hang an antenna up to the smokestack. Hams are always there. You're always a ham, and you can always find friends, and you can get on the air, and you'll never be lonely or anything like that. It's probably more important for people my age than it is for kids, actually, because you have a social group. You always have a social group.
You're so right about that. I think that one of the biggest problems that older people have is loneliness, because the kids move away and they have their own lives. The spouse passes away, perhaps. A ham radio operator that has a transceiver still has a connection to the outside world.
Yeah, you have people to talk to you anytime you want to. And I'm almost 77. I'll be 77 next month, and I feel like I'm always going to have friends. I'm always going to be able to start a conversation anytime I want to about anything I want to talk about.
No matter what, and you can do it from your home, even when there's 12 feet of snow on your stairs.
Yeah. Well, it's more like about 6 feet, but it was enough.
It looks like quite enough. Did you get a sense when you were renewing your license and becoming more active, is there a place in Norwegian ham radio for young people?
They're trying of course they've got the Scouts program and things, but they're talking about getting an entry license just to get in these kids. Hams are sort of, on the average, they're fairly old, and they're very much interested in recruiting new kids. So they're talking about getting a simpler license. Of course, any kid that has any interest in they will get help from the neighbors probably, or from the other hams around if they find out about it. I don't think the clubs basically run their own programs for it, but they do. A lot of them are involved with the Boy Scouts or the Scouts now, getting with the radio. Even when I was at Christian Song, when I was in school.
Do you get a sense that there is perhaps some sense of urgency in Norway for creating young people that actually have technical abilities beyond programming computers? I look at what you do with your mechanical engineering and the ingenuity that you show. You're right now in your workshop. You're surrounded by tools.
Oh, yeah, this is my workshop. I'm going to put the transceiver on a piece of foam rubber as soon as I can, because I don't think it's good for me to saw and pound under the transceiver.
I also saw there's a bandsaw in there too, right?
Yeah, that's just a jigsaw. I did have a bandsaw sitting there, and it took up too much room.
The question I'm asking, Susan, is that do you see that young people actually are developing the skills that you'd have to actually have a shop with tools, and are they building stuff? Do you see kids building stuff in Norway?
My kids didn't really build anything, but my son, he seems to have the ability to fix anything. Like when I was trying to format the card on this transceiver, it didn't want to do it. And he says, well, it wants, FAT32. I said, how do you know that? I said, oh, but he did. If kids don't want to go the college route, they have alternative courses to try to keep them in school and learn something else, bricklaying or whatever. Hams don't have really any recruiting program, and the license test is probably terrifying. A kid couldn't take it.
Norway's never had an entry-level license.
No, they don't have it now anyway. I don't think they've ever had it since I've been here. And they're working on it now. And that would be a good way to start. But otherwise, they're going to have to start with at least high school kids, if not older, to have the background to absorb it.
Right. But the school system in Norway is very similar to perhaps the other European countries, and that is at the beginning of the high school years, the track breaks into either college-bound or more hands-on technical.
Yeah, they have a lot of that, yeah. Mm-hmm. They do. If the kids don't want to go to college, you can earn just as much money as a plumber, And if you don't really want to learn a lot of theory or history or whatever, that's an alternative.
The education system does create workers who can kind of maintain and keep the infrastructure of Norway going.
Yeah, I think a lot of the hams are basically, a lot of the hams started out with computer programming. Of course, everybody started out with computer programming at that age now. They do build things too, I think.
Do you have advice that you'd give for new hams or people returning to the hobby after years of being out? What kind of advice would you give them?
I would sign up for the course, and I would, when you got your license, get on 2 meters, because 2 meters hasn't changed. Everything else has changed with digital or what have you. But the 2 meters is basically the same as it ever was, except it almost always goes through repeaters, and it's not overloaded or anything. You can just get on a repeater and somebody will answer you.
So the advantage of 2 meters then to you is that it actually kind of ferrets out the local community of hams.
Yeah, the local hams, yeah. Yeah, I don't really hear them on the HF. I don't hear them very often. No, I think we're skipping over, and I haven't got room for an 80-meter antenna.
I could see that. Although there's some very interesting 80-meter designs out there now, or even a magnetic loop or something.
That might work. My trouble is partly that there's no ground, really, except that garden out in front of the house. And that's only 3 feet deep. Yeah, we're built on a rock.
I thought that was very interesting. If you look at your videos, you'll actually see that the whole town is built on a rock.
You're not allowed to build buildings on agricultural ground. So everybody builds on rocks here. So a ground here is a definite problem. Finding a good ground. You can get artificial grounds, I guess.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. In one of your videos, you actually were putting a ground rod next to the entrance where you bring the cables.
Yeah, the thing is, these ground spikes they sell for ham radio, whatever, they're about this long. Get a copper covered steel rod for electric fence. That's what you need. You can pound that way down. Of course,
you're not pounding it into the rock.
No. But at least it's longer than a foot. Yeah, you could use a pipe too, I guess. I just got the steel rod because it was copper, and I was using copper radials, and the antenna, everything was copper. So I figure it won't corrode if I drown it in rubber cement and self-fusing tape and what have you.
Before we go, Susan, is there something that we should talk about that we didn't cover?
Like I say, everybody, once they're a ham, they're always a ham. I never considered myself not being a ham. And so that it's always been on my plan to get back into radio. But I just never, with this location, I'm looking for a house. I went someplace else. I don't want to go up 44 steps when I get older anyway. With batteries, those bicycle batteries weigh 20 kilos each or something.
You're schlepping those batteries up and down the steps?
Yeah. I mean, I could drive a long ways on. I could drive 140 kilometers on two of those batteries, but they're awfully heavy for me to drag up and down the hill. And we don't have power in the garages. So I want to get someplace where I can put out antennas and I can just jump on a tricycle and go wherever I want.
And what are your options there in southern Norway?
I don't want to be right downtown. I want to be someplace where I can put out antennas. We don't have the problem with antennas that you have in America in housing projects, but still. People don't want you to put up a big tri-bander.
I think a lot of people nowadays think that the larger the antenna, the more dangerous the radiation. I hear that from people as well. Look, I also hear it about people that are worried about Wi-Fi. And I had somebody tell me they didn't want fiber optic cable running through their house because they were afraid of the radiation from fiber optic cable.
They don't radiate.
That's what I said. I said, well, you should wear a hat when you're outside in the sun. I think that you probably have more radiation from the sun.
Yeah. When we got to the RF interference and stuff in the course, and all the things are coming in antennas and coming in parabolic antennas and coming in TV cables. But they don't have regular TV here anymore. It's all through cables. A few people have parabolic antennas, but everything comes in, the telephone and everything comes in through fibers now, or the telephones are all Wi-Fi. They're all over the air anyway. You don't have the things, you can't get into anything anymore, really. So interference in people's TVs and things it's not a problem anymore, really.
You don't have copper telephone lines anymore?
No, they got rid of them. We had to get a copy of one. It looks like a telephone, but it's actually Android. They don't have them. They don't support them anymore.
Susan, it was such a pleasure to speak to you on QSO Today. You have an unusual story, but I think that the takeaway for me is that if you're an older person who's been out of ham radio for a while, it's never too late to jump back in. And I think that ham radio seems to be what you're saying. It's a lifelong opportunity to continually to remain social.
Yeah, it is.
I think that's an amazing takeaway.
And you always have something in common with the people you talk to. If you can't talk about kids or something like that, you've still got the radio. You talk about radios.
I never get tired of talking about radio. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming on QSO today. And with that, I want to wish you 73, and I hope that I work you on HF, or if your 2-meter repeater connects to All-Star or something like that, that we'll have a chance to work each other.
Yeah, I've got to figure out those other modes. I don't know them yet, but I do hear down that far. I hear Israel, but they don't hear me yet, so I have to figure out either move or figure out an improvement on my antennas.
As I say, try a magnetic loop. You might find that an interesting antenna, and it doesn't take up a lot of space.
Yeah, you could build them.
That's exactly right. It's more mechanical than it is electronic.
I like to build stuff.
Thank you so much. 73.
Okay. 73. Thank you for the interview. Bye-bye.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Susan. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in LA0CY in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.